Hello, this is Bruce Eder, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation of Laurence Olivier's Henry V. Henry V was the first successful screen adaptation of a Shakespeare play. Up until its release, film adaptations of Shakespeare had succeeded neither as Shakespeare nor as films. Olivier's was the first to succeed on both counts. He did this with an approach that was different from any other before him. Those who came before, such as George Cukor with Romeo and Juliet, had created works that chafed against the original plays, awkwardly stuffing theater onto the movie screen. Olivier, by contrast, reveled in Henry's theatrical origins while also using the strongest elements of cinema, as in this shot, a playbill blown in the wind right up to the camera, which tells us exactly what we're about to see, a May 1st, 1600 performance of Henry at the Globe Playhouse. This is a pure cinematic effect. For its time, it's a dazzling credit sequence, plunging the viewer right into the film in a playful and surprising manner. One element that viewers shouldn't overlook, and which was certainly impressive to audiences in 1944, was that Henry V was the first, and for many years, the only Shakespeare film shot in color. The Technicolor is simply glorious in this sequence. Coupled with the music and the camera movement, the effect is to seduce, and then, as the film progresses, bedazzle the viewer. But these special effects have a significant purpose for Olivier, as we shall see. This model shot of London takes us from Ludgate Hill to the Tower of London, past Old St. Paul's Cathedral and numerous churches, and London Bridge, and south to the Bear Garden, and then the Globe. It's important to realize that Henry V was more than just an attempt to film a Shakespeare play. It was also made as a propaganda film, intended to boost the morale of the Allies. It was important for reasons far beyond mere profit and loss that it be seen and embraced by a wide audience. So Olivier utilized every piece of the cinematic vernacular that he could employ effectively. As we shall see, the time in which it was made, and the fact that it was a propaganda film, played a big role in Olivier's decisions about what was to be done with Henry V on screen, from cuts in the text to the manner in which Henry V is presented. After hovering over the Bear Garden for a moment, now moving out of view, the camera moves north, in on this model of the Globe Playhouse. The Globe, incidentally, was only built in 1599, the year in which Henry was first performed. The model of London used here was huge, by the way, 50 by 70 feet across, made of wood and plaster. And here, as we move in on the Globe Theatre, Olivier pulls the first of several unexpected conjurer's tricks. From a purely cinematic series of opening shots, we plunge into what is essentially a realistic recreation of the world of Elizabethan London. Even the music in this sequence is scored and presented as being played by on-screen musicians, real music in the vernacular of the movie business. The movie takes on a new form, a play within a film. This will later become a film within a play within a film, and then return back to being a play within a film. Film scholar Harry Goddard describes the structure as resembling a series of Chinese boxes, each one in turn opening or leading us to a new and differently styled box or section. This structure evolved out of necessity. In trying to make Henry V into a popular film, Olivier and his co-screenwriter Alan Dent had to overcome several obstacles that had fatally damaged earlier attempts by far more experienced filmmakers in their dealings with Shakespeare. The biggest problem from their point of view was, strangely enough, the language. Shakespeare's plays were written in what officially is referred to as early modern English, a form of English, especially in its grammar and meanings, just different enough from 20th century usage to repel mass audiences. It was a lot to ask moviegoers to sit still for 2 hours plus, to be moved and entertained in a language that felt at worst alien and at best unfamiliar. Changing the language was unthinkable, so Olivier and Dent faced up to the task of making it accessible. Most of Henry was written in blank verse, and was generally accessible once an audience was accustomed to the grammar. That's where the film's opening came in. The chorus's lofty invocation was the least accessible part of Henry V. Presenting the chorus's introduction in a realistic fashion was a way of pulling the viewer into the more straightforward body of the play. And so we get Leslie Banks in one of his most delightful screen roles. What Olivier and Dent did was to bring the audience into a recreation of a May 1st, 1600 performance of Henry V, focusing on the chorus, immersing the viewer in the most difficult part of the play. This play within a film conceit becomes the frame to the main body of the film, in much the same manner that the chorus's introduction frames the main body of the play. Oh, and here's a funny topical reference in the play itself.
Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France, or may we cram within this wooden O?
The wooden O was the globe. And here we get a brilliant camera move.
On your imaginary forces work. Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined...
The chorus steps toward the camera, addressing it directly, and it dollies in to meet him. This camera movement is completely at odds with the leisurely panning that we've had up to now. The chorus addresses the viewer directly, and then dolly out. For an instant, the movie's emphasis transforms, morphs from theatrical to cinematic. And you can hear that the music suddenly ceases to be realistic. There's piano, perhaps, and certainly a larger string section than one suspects the Globe ever employed. And then we're back to a theatrical, almost documentary presentation as the camera pulls back further and we see the stage again, complete with echo as part of the ambiance of the Globe, and the film music disappears.
Kindly to judge our play.
The Globe musicians are back with audience interaction, and we're into the body of the play proper. And here is where the real genius behind the structure of this opening sequence took hold on the public. The decision to present the opening section of the film in a realistic period setting was done initially to help solve the problem of the language barrier, and the novelty of the play within a film drew the audience into the setting and the period of the work. But this opening, the part of the opening that we're seeing here, also accomplished two other functions which were equally, if not more, important. The tendency of filmmakers in dealing with Shakespeare up to this point in time had been to play it with as much dignity as possible. The problem was that this tended to stifle a lot of freedom of expression, especially where humor was concerned, in approaching Shakespeare. This was a reflection of the esteem in which Shakespeare is held by our culture. But esteem can be a deadening thing. Shakespeare becomes one of those icons that we place on a pedestal, important but remote. The reverence was understandable, but it had unfortunate results. Shakespeare's work often ended up being treated with a certain amount of awe, whether in a classroom or on a Hollywood soundstage. The film Shakespeare up to this point was respectful to the point of cold sterility, broken up in some instances by lapses of taste that made for sequences with the delicacy of a ballet of elephants. The opening of Henry V reminded film audiences that Shakespeare's plays were living, breathing works, performed by flesh and blood actors and seen by flesh and blood, and yes, sometimes boisterous audiences. This whole sequence was a revelation to many filmgoers in the 1940s. This opening took Shakespeare back to his roots, presenting what might have been a Globe Playhouse performance of 1600. The flawed, even crude performances offered here, and the audience's boisterous reactions, especially when Sir John Falstaff is mentioned, gave us a look at the Elizabethan theater in the raw.
Falstaff and all his company along with him.
The lines here specifically about Falstaff, incidentally, are not from Henry V. They're put in here by Olivier and Dent to augment the discussion of Henry's early life, as depicted in the two plays that immediately preceded Henry V, Henry IV Parts 1 and 2. For the movies, the treatment of this opening was a radical, even cynical approach to presenting Shakespeare. There were critics, especially among some Elizabethan theater scholars, who deeply resented the section of the film that we're seeing here. They felt that Olivier was having too much fun at the expense of this scene and its seriousness. Others felt they had denigrated the Elizabethan theater, especially the Globe Playhouse, in terms of the levels of professionalism that each achieved on a regular basis. And James Agee felt that the whole tone of this section patronized the audience.
To give a greater sum than ever at one time,
the loud interaction with the audience serves an additional subtle purpose here, however. The humor and the boisterousness obscures the cynicism of the two clerics' plan to dissuade Henry from supporting a bill that would strip the church of half of its wealth. Instead, they will use the church's influence to raise money and an army to help him invade France, the conquest of France offering far greater wealth than he could ever obtain from the church. That cynicism opens the question of Olivier's choice of Henry V as the basis for a film. The play itself is one of Shakespeare's most deceptively complex. On one level, it is a jingoistic celebration of a war that, for a time in the 15th century, gave England's king control of a part of France. But there is enough honest cynicism in the play, the underlying motivation of the bishops, and Henry's occasional lapses into savagery, to reassure us that Shakespeare wasn't just playing to the basest feelings of his audience. Olivier was making Henry V in the middle of World War II. Thousands were being killed daily around the world. He was making his movie for an audience that couldn't afford to plunge too deeply into cynicism. And so he uses comedy, and some liberties with the camera as well, to keep the film audience partly distracted from those cynical elements. I love this backstage view of the Elizabethan theater, boys making themselves up as women in the custom of the time, and the hurried application of makeup and donning of costumes. Some purists felt that this was condescending, but it does capture a certain immediacy. William Walton's music here, more real music from the theater orchestra as the actors take the stage, sets the mood. The fanfare sets a tone of anticipation that is palpable for the audience beyond the curtain and for us. The actor playing Henry, played by Olivier, takes the stage after some slight hesitation. We get room ambience here, applause echoes and noises from a realistic backstage view of the performance.
Lord of Canterbury, not here in presence. Send for him, Godango.
This looks like an off-kilter camera angle, since the Henry of the Globe production is suddenly out of shot. But nothing vital to us is taking place on stage, and Olivier has something else to emphasize. And then suddenly the camera is mobile, taking us off stage completely and backstage, and then following the actor playing the Archbishop back on stage. We get echoes, noises, voices center stage but suddenly off mic, and foibles and flubs. The actor hovering around the edges of this scene, playing the Bishop of Ely, is Robert Helpmann. There he is in the center in green. He was most familiar as a ballet dancer and choreographer. He had been in only one movie, Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's One of Our Aircraft is Missing. He was a friend of Olivier's and Vivien Leigh and had worked with both of them. Helpmann puts his skills to work here in the service of more distraction. As written, the part of the Bishop of Ely is supposed to be almost silent, a passive role, while the Archbishop does most of the talking. But that wouldn't do for Olivier's film. He didn't want to eliminate the core of this scene, as Henry discusses law with the Archbishop. At the same time, Olivier and Alan Dent recognize that past a certain point, the Archbishop's speech becomes steeped in legalisms and history that no film audience was going to absorb in full. What Olivier does is to add something to distract us again, as he did in the earlier scene. This was Robert Helpmann as the bishop. Many serious-minded critics resented Helpmann's performance for his comedic fumblings. There is a certain Stan Laurel-like quality in his gaunt presence in the midst of this high-worded dialogue. The way he is shoved around backstage in the earlier scene only accentuates the physical nature of the portrayal. As the unctuous, if sincere, Archbishop, played by Felix Aylmer, begins expounding on points that only a legal scholar could dissect, something was needed to keep the audience, the camera, and the film moving.
Then doth it well appear the Salic law was not devised for the realm of France, nor did the French possess the Salic land until 421 years after defunction of King.
Helpman is hardly moving here, but in a few seconds as the account of history and law become too involved, he will dominate the scene. His facial expressions and overall miming are extraordinary, Chaplin-esque really. He and Aylmer make a perfect team, ideal foils for each other, the impossibly dignified and the hopelessly inept, the self-satisfied and the put-upon. The more involved and dignified the archbishop becomes, the more complex his narrative, the more stressed becomes the bishop, which leads to this build-up of visual chaos.
The crown of Charles, the Duke of Lorraine, sole heir male of the true line and stock of Charles the Great.
Helpman's antics break the monotony and the tension. They're the comic resolution to the seriousness of the dialogue. There's an almost vaudevillian component here. The Archbishop is such an inviting target. Watching it, I'm reminded of the Monty Python lecturer on comedy, expounding on edible missiles before he is hit in the face with a pie. Olivier is playing a double game here, presenting something of the vitality and immediacy of live theater, while also showing some of the inevitable limitations of theater, both in its physical boundaries and actual execution. Helpman was a consummate scene stealer. He could do it with the cock of an eye or the tiniest change of expression. If you want to see an even better example of his work, look at Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, made 23 years after Henry V. The movie is deadly dull, static for much of its length, but Helpman's 10 minutes or so on screen as the child catcher are the liveliest, most exciting, and unpredictable of the entire movie. You can complain about what Olivier has done to Shakespeare with these diversions, but there had to be some strategy for holding the audience. He and Alan Dent have taken what should have been an important but dramatically dead spot in the play, and a lethal spot for modern audiences, and kept the camera in motion, the dialogue flowing, and the audience entertained, but listening to what is important. And what is important is simply that there is a dispute over Henry's rights in France, by way of his ancestry. And whatever its faults, these first 15 minutes of Henry V are amazingly exciting and lively for the viewer, considering that nothing has happened yet. Compare them to the first 15 minutes of Olivier's only other Shakespearean film up to this time, Paul Zinner's As You Like It, made 7 years earlier, in which he played the young hero Orlando. Orlando is banished by his elder brother, the fate of the Duke is told about, and the heroine is introduced. It is true to the text, it is faithful to the serious attitude that people were supposed to have toward Shakespeare, and it is unremittingly dull, despite a sincere and impassioned performance by Olivier. The heart of the matter here is how the French, the medieval French I should emphasize, present themselves. As Harry Godold points out, we're at a point where Henry can act the bold hero and express his ambition, but we're not entirely certain, if we were to look closely at what we've been shown to this point, why. The medieval French here are the stand-ins, in topical terms, for the Germans at the outset of World War II. Arrogant, mocking, rude. Shakespeare's sources for his knowledge of Henry V, and all of the historical material in the play, were derived from Hollingshead's Chronicles of the Kings of England, Scotland, and Ireland, the second edition of which was published in 1587, a dozen years before the play was written. But this particular scene appears to derive from an earlier theatrical work. This mockery, the gift of tennis balls, referring to Henry's formative years spent as what we would call a playboy, comes from a rather crude chronicle play, The Famous Victories of Henry V, which first appeared in the 1580s. Two other key scenes, Pistol's encounter with a French soldier and the wooing of Catherine in the play's final act, also appear to have originated in this earlier play. But that work in itself was a corrupted version of a still earlier theatrical work. Shakespeare appears to have been familiar at least with the corrupted edition. Olivier does something unique with his camera here. In Henry's first big scene, his first major heroic speech, he pulls the camera back. The tendency in scenes such as this, with most filmmakers, would be to go to a tightening close-up. Olivier's belief was that the best Elizabethan acting involved assured gestures and a loud voice. He emphasizes this continuously in cinematic terms with wider, not tighter shots. The film keeps transforming itself here, in this speech. He pulls back further, and the camera slowly follows Olivier, still playing the actor playing Henry, essentially, as he moves across the stage. The dimensions of the globe and the stage are clearly felt in these moves. The audio quality takes on that echoey resonance, evoking the globe's wooden O.
Tell you the Dauphin, we are coming on to vengeance as we may, and to put forth our rightful claim in one hallowed cause, so get you hence in peace. And tell the Dauphin, his jest will savor but of shallow wit, when thousands weep more than did laugh at it. Convey them with safe conduct, fare you well.
This part of the film is steeped in a form of recreated realism, a very vivid picture of the thing it means to represent an Elizabethan stage performance of Henry V. I find continual surprises in the movie throughout, but the opening is most extraordinary, a cross between a magic act and a complex cinematic exploration of the Elizabethan consciousness behind the play. The effect is disarming and absorbing as the tensions and the dialogue wind tight. Leslie Banks, who plays the chorus, was one of the most beloved actors in English theater and films. He was a choice leading man for Alfred Hitchcock in The Man Who Knew Too Much, a sinister villain for Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack in The Most Dangerous Game, a chillingly cool-mannered German fifth columnist in Alberto Cavalcante's Went the Day Well, and played a key supporting role in Powell and Pressburger's The Small Back Room. In this scene, he gets to show off a deeply resonant voice that film audiences seldom got to hear in his less extroverted roles. If you look closely, you'll also see that his right profile is paralyzed. This was from a World War I injury, and it didn't stop him from achieving stardom. He was perhaps most famous on stage as Captain Hook in a 1924 production of Peter Pan that came to New York. Now we get the cinematic equivalent of a grace note from an orchestral concert, a little embellishment that reminds us we're still in Elizabethan London. A storm breaks out, forcing audience members to the ring of the open-roofed theater, and reminding us that these performances in Shakespeare's time were done under natural light. Theater was a daylight social activity in those days. Amid all of these transformations, Olivier has succeeded in creating an opening that modern audiences could embrace and absorb as a convincing portrait of Shakespeare's audience. The nuances of Elizabethan acting, a picture of the texture of Elizabethan theater, an informed suspension of disbelief, similar to that called for by the chorus in his opening speech, in asking us to imagine what should be on stage. The movie will take care of the horses and armies. What Olivier has done is gotten us to imagine how Shakespeare's audience saw the play. It is what Neil MacDonald, writing in the McGraw-Hill Encyclopedia of World Theatre, described quite aptly as an Elizabethan movie. These two actors didn't live to see Henry V's success, sadly. Roy Emerton as the taller Bardolph and Frederick Cooper as the diminutive Corporal Nym had worked on stage for decades, but Emerton died in December of 1944 and Cooper in January of the following year. This part of the play had all kinds of resonances to Elizabethan audiences. We've seen the story of the outset of Henry's campaign from the point of view of the highborn. Now it's time for a look at the French campaign as seen by the lowborn. In the setting of the Boar's Head Inn in the plays Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, Shakespeare had created some of his most popular characters. Sir John Falstaff and the coterie of thieves and knaves, Nym, Bardolph, and most notably Pistol, that hang about him. Ancient Pistol, in particular, was a popular rogue. He gets as rousing a welcome as Henry from one part of the audience, the section that no doubt earlier heckled the Bishop of Ely. This is Robert Newton in his first comedy role, the first in a series of outsized roles by which he delighted audiences around the world for 15 years. Newton was born in Shaftesbury, Dorset, in 1905, and educated in England and Switzerland. His first appearance on stage was in a walk-on part in Henry IV in the Birmingham Repertory production. He played in classic and modern works, Ibsen, Shaw, Shakespeare, and in 1931 succeeded Olivier in the New York theatrical production of Noel Coward's Private Lives in the role of Victor Prynne. That was also his New York stage debut. He made his screen debut in 1936 in a key supporting role in Fire Over England, the first film starring Olivier to get reasonably wide distribution outside of England. This was also the film on which Olivier met Vivien Leigh. Newton appeared in a succession of films, playing the hero in Hitchcock's Jamaica Inn and a key supporting role in Major Barbara. David Lean worked with Newton on that movie and cast him in a leading role in This Happy Breed. Newton served in the Royal Navy aboard a minesweeper, but was regularly requisitioned as an actor. He already had a reputation as a heavy drinker, according to those who worked with him, but was so good an actor that directors and producers were willing to take the risk. Until Henry V, he was known mostly for his straight acting performances, not the kind of broad comedy that he is playing here. You couldn't come in on Henry V not knowing about the background and expect to appreciate it in full, but the broadness of Newton's performance meant that you would understand most of what was going on. Henry V is often misconstrued as a glorification of war, but in fact the playwright did include these scenes reminding us that rogues often capitalized on war. These scenes bring up a matter that might be difficult to understand by today's moral standards. Falstaff and his coterie of thieves and rogues could evoke laughter and pleasure even in Queen Elizabeth herself. But at the same time, they represented, within the framework of Elizabethan morality, a force that had to be rejected and put down. So the court could laugh at Falstaff and company in Henry IV Part 1, but look on approvingly as Sir John is rejected by the new king in Part 2. In fact, Henry's French campaign wasn't a clean one, even by the standards of Elizabethan England. He went there with an army that was primarily made up of infantry, foot soldiers and archers, not titled nobles or men sworn to them, and a lot of them were there to pillage and steal what they could. Henry's occupation was marred by theft, rape, and other abuse of the populace. Olivier has this scene played for broad comedy because he was making a morale-boosting film about an impending invasion to liberate France. But Shakespeare did include a reminder of the theft and pillage, only to deflect the responsibility for it away from Henry onto the lowborn who went with him to France. Shakespeare had to avoid attributing moral failing by Elizabethan standards to Henry, for Henry's claim to the throne was as a descendant of John of Gaunt, the 14th century Duke of Lancaster and son of Edward III, and this was the same basis as the claim that the Tudor dynasty, including Queen Elizabeth, had to the throne. We're back to the chorus, but now something wonderful is about to happen. We've had 29 minutes of balletic movement between stage and cinematic elements in Henry V. Now we move into a more painterly telling of Henry V at the invitation of the chorus.
But here, till then, Unto Southampton do we change our scene.
Through the scrim and to a backdrop and a pan to the left, and we are aboard a ship. A ship as it might appear on a crowded stage, but also designed and shot in the two-dimensional form of a medieval painting. This scene was intended to look very different from the opening, realistic section of the movie. Olivier and his production designers had gone into Henry V with three different looks to the major sections of the film in mind. The enactment of theatrical reality in the first section, a stylized medieval look to the various parts of the center of the movie, especially those scenes set at court in France, and a cinematic reality to the battle scenes. Any studio art director, certainly in Hollywood, who proposed a set and costumes designed in this way for a movie based on Shakespeare or anything but a pure fantasy film, would probably have been kicked off the lot. It was this unreality that movies, in some people's eyes, were supposed to banish. Now, here, we get a scene in which Henry orders the release of someone arrested for treason. Olivier was forced to cut, for the sake of length as well as content, the play's depiction of a treason against the king by members of the nobility, which he answers with execution. Those cuts had to be made, along with other changes, to make Henry an acceptable heroic figure in the 20th century.
And eke out our performance with your...
And now we get the first conventional cinematic dissolve since the beginning of the opening credits. We're now wholly in a cinematic mode. Having shown us what the stage can do and can't do, Olivier is now letting the camera and a purer cinematic environment take over. The death of Falstaff, which we see here, is one of the most famous scenes in the film, but it's not in the play. In the play, Falstaff's death is spoken of but not reenacted. I'd like to say something about the creation of this, one of Shakespeare's most popular characters. Like the girth of the character himself, Falstaff outgrew the anticipated boundaries of his existence. Scholars differ as to the inspiration for Falstaff. Some claim that Shakespeare created him entirely out of his own imagination, but in fact, the author had at least two sources. It is generally presumed that, in the original performances of Henry IV Part I in 1597, Falstaff was called Sir John Oldcastle, but that Shakespeare had to alter the text. Even in the existing text of Henry IV Part I, there is a veiled reference that ties Falstaff to Oldcastle. This whole scene is a fascinating interpolation. We never see Falstaff in Shakespeare's play Henry V, though he is spoken of. Incidentally, that is Sir George Robey, one of the most beloved and popular stage performers in England, playing Falstaff. And the lines that we hear in Olivier's voiceover, rejecting Falstaff, are not in Henry V. Olivier and Dent transpose them from Henry IV Part II in order to make the film's action and relationships clearer. They work as a sort of audio flashback. Tampering with Shakespeare may seem like sacrilege until one remembers that it is almost always done, and in this case the filmmakers have only added material from other, earlier Shakespeare plays. Olivier himself did this most boldly in his film of Richard III, opening the movie with a scene from the ending of Henry VI Part III, the coronation of Edward IV. That material was needed in order for the film audiences to fully grasp Richard's Winter of Our Discontent speech. Getting back to Falstaff, why the change in name? Sir John Oldcastle, later Lord Cobham, was a familiar historical figure. In 1408, he provided important military support to Henry IV in Wales, where he did, indeed, befriend the young Prince Hal, later Henry V. But he subsequently became an adherent to the teaching of John Wycliffe, a theologian and religious reformer. Wycliffe was part of an anti-clerical movement that anticipated the Reformation in Europe. His followers, the Lollards, were persecuted. Among these was Oldcastle, who was hanged as a heretic in 1417, 2 years after the events in Henry V's opening. Within Shakespeare's time, the chronicle play The Famous Victories of Henry V One of his historical sources also made reference to Oldcastle. Oldcastle, as depicted in Henry IV, proved to be among the most popular characters that Shakespeare ever created. But that, in turn, created a major problem with Sir William Brooke, the 7th Baron Cobham, and a descendant of Oldcastle. Brooke was very much alive at the close of the 16th century and a very powerful figure at court, and Shakespeare didn't want to offend him for obvious reasons. And so Oldcastle not only became Falstaff, but in the epilogue to Henry IV, Part 2, Shakespeare specifically denies any connection between Falstaff and Oldcastle. The very last lines of the play are, "One more word, I beseech you. If you be not too much cloyed with fat meat, our humble author will continue the story with Sir John in, and make you merry with fair Katherine of France, where, for anything I know, Falstaff shall die of a sweat, unless already be killed with your hard opinions. For Oldcastle died martyr, and this is not the man." Shakespeare's replacement as a source for the name of his fat knight was far less controversial. A Sir John Fastolf had served in France with distinction under Henry's forces, and was later elevated to the knighthood of the Garter, the king's personal order. In 1429, while conducting a convoy of supplies in France, he was attacked by a superior force and saved his men and his cargo by using herring barrels for protection in what became known, yes, as the Battle of the Herrings. He had no noble descendants of any influence, which made him a safer choice for embellishment in Shakespeare's plays. Whether his name was Oldcastle or Falstaff, the public, including Queen Elizabeth, loved him enough to force Shakespeare to write an entire play around him, The Merry Wives of Windsor. After Henry IV, Part 1, he wrote the comedy, which is presumed by some scholars to have been performed in the year 1597 as part of a royal celebration. The Merry Wives of Windsor, which fits nowhere into the chronologies of any of the history plays, proved to be one of Shakespeare's most well-received comedies and a rich source for composers. Giuseppe Verdi with Falstaff is the most well-known. Otto Nicolai, the founder of the Vienna Philharmonic, wrote the even more beautiful and charming Merry Wives of Windsor in the mid-19th century. Sir Edward Elgar composed the symphonic study Falstaff at the end of that century. Gustav Holst was responsible for At the Boar's Head early in the 20th century, and Ralph Vaughan Williams wrote Sir John in Love and In Windsor Forest during the 1920s, all based on the Merry Wives of Windsor. He is no more than an incidental character in Henry V, but his death scene gives Olivier the chance to do something more with the character of Ancient Pistol, as we see here.
Farewell, farewell, divine Zenocrate. Is it not passing brave?
The lines that Robert Newton speaks are not from Shakespeare, but are instead a direct quotation from Tamburlaine the Great, a play written by Shakespeare's contemporary Christopher Marlowe. It was first produced in 1587, a dozen years before Henry V. It's a wonderful mock-heroic flourish, giving Ancient Pistol a charming exit, better for the camera than the quieter departure in the original play.
Suppose that you have seen the well-appointed king at Hampton Pier embark his royalty...
And those who object to any tampering with text would have to concede that, at least in their editions, Olivier and Dent have not drawn upon any material that post-dated the work at hand, only from the earlier Henry IV Part 2 and Tamburlaine the Great, nothing that couldn't have been within the scope of Shakespeare's knowledge. Ah, the chorus is becoming a disembodied presence, reduced as it were to a voice with this dissolve. The Globe Playhouse is long gone from the film now. The little ships appear and disappear, and we move into another visually distinct stylistic section of the film, the French court. Olivier and his collaborators, going into pre-production, had decided that each section of the film should have a different look.
will not follow these culled and choice-drawn cavaliers to France. The French, advised by good intelligence of this most...
When the film was first discussed, he later wrote in The Making of Henry V, we decided that the treatment would have to be new, yet in keeping with the period. The middle part of the film especially must have the feeling of the 14th century, but we would only achieve this aim if the settings and general composition of the shots caught the spirit of 14th century paintings. The result is another of those Chinese boxes opening from within. The film was planned as a painter's eye view of moving events, which meant that there were only painted cutouts for the backgrounds. Olivier recommended to Paul Sheriff, the film's production designer, that he specifically look to the Duke of Berry's Book of Hours, a 14th century work that is considered one of the great treasures in the field of illuminated manuscripts. Now, as it happens, when the movie was in production, the original manuscript was held in France and obviously unavailable to be consulted. But an art periodical called Verve in 1940 had reproduced the 12 calendar pages from the manuscript, and Harry Goddard suggests that these were probably what Sheriff and Olivier had to work with, along with reproductions of illustrations of works by Froissart from the same period. You can see this material in our supplementary section. Essentially, Olivier, Sheriff, and company, including cinematographer Robert Krasker, were reinventing the wheel here in terms of how to shoot a movie and even compose a shot. Medieval painting, including the images in illuminated manuscripts, have no feeling of perspective. They're distinctly two-dimensional, with flat backgrounds, and the size relationships between people and objects is often distorted. Nobody was quite sure whether film, especially Technicolor film, could be made to mimic this quality. It meant, among other matters, that in lighting the sets and choosing the camera angles, there could be no trace of shadows, because shadows enforced the illusion of depth, and depth of field or perspective was precisely what was not wanted for the scenes in the French court. Moreover, Technicolor film required vast amounts of light, far greater than ordinary black and white film. So these sets were lit from directly above. Indeed, if you look even at the scenes of Henry aboard ship, or with his troops on the fields of France, you find that these have a distinctly medieval feel as well. They're crowded, clustered together, the men pressed together with their bows and other weapons, in much the same manner as paintings of that period. I should interrupt myself here to mention the content of what we're seeing, the French court as depicted in the film and the play. Henry V was clearly written to English sympathies, and the French court is contrasted with the British very distinctly. A quiet place, ruled over by a somewhat befuddled king and a snobbish, egocentric, pretentious prince, the Dauphin, whose arrogance is as offensive to his own generals and retainers as it is to the British. But now let's get back to the images. Something I noticed many years ago when I first saw the movie and looked at stills from Henry V was that the shots look natural as film only when they're seen in context as parts of the movie, which is to say, in motion. But you see how well Olivier and company have succeeded in what they set out to do by virtue of the fact that, as stills, they don't look like film material at all, but rather have the look of medieval paintings, or strange modern equivalents of them, stripping away everything that artists and photographers have learned in the 500 or so years since. The choices of color and costumes in these sequences were also dictated by what was then known about life in the 15th century. Only the types of fabrics known to have been in use and the dyes that would have been available to men and women of different social strata were used in the film. Olivier, Sheriff, Krasker, and art director Carmen Dillon and costume designers Roger Furse and Margaret Furse were guided in their work by the conventions of medieval painting in one other major respect, the use of bright colors to emphasize certain parts of an image. You see it in some of these shots, the golds, the bright reds, and deep blues. This is very primitive, but shall we say direct and aggressive use of Technicolor. It's also a use of Technicolor film to achieve effects that were a half a millennium removed from the advent of motion pictures. Quite startling when you think about it. It's a movie that could not have been done in anything like the same way in black and white. Speaking of black and white, it was a drawback of working in Technicolor that one only had black and white rushes to look at each day of the previous day's shooting, and black and white rushes off of Technicolor film were notably muddy in texture and tone. That was what Olivier had to look at for most of the production of Henry V. And while experienced filmmakers were accustomed to making adjustment in their minds for what they weren't seeing, the poor quality of the rushes caused him to lose confidence at various points. And the fact that Olivier was not an experienced filmmaker goes to the heart of what makes Henry so special as a movie. It's been said of this film for the last 50 years or so that it came out as well as it did and was as successful as it was because it was made by people whose experience was primarily in theater, not in movies. That is, they were not only comfortable with the Shakespearean material, but they came in with notions of staging that weren't limited to cinematic conventions of the period. There was no one among them, other than the technically experienced cinema artists like Robert Krasker, to tell them that they couldn't do something on technical grounds. Make the middle of the movie look like pages of a medieval manuscript? Why not? Keep shifting the setting and the point of view of the film from Elizabethan realism to medieval iconography to armor-rattling battle scenes? Why not? And one of the results is a movie that didn't look like any other film ever made. Now we've gone from a screen decorated like a medieval manuscript to a modern montage.
Once more, unto the breach!
And we're into one of the most famous lines in theater or literature. And look at this shot. It's every medieval depiction of a king at the head of his troops, brought to life, crowded in, the banners there and the weapons. And again, Olivier has the camera pulled back for this speech, from close-up to wide shot, letting his voice build the tension and the intensity, while the camera does what it does best, showing us the panorama around Henry. Olivier had great confidence in his own abilities here. His voice, his acting drive the scene. The camera pulls back gradually, and the effect is riveting. He wanted to defy convention and keep the camera moving, keep the film as visually startling as possible. And he's doing it on the cheap. Ideally, he might have shown a good portion of the thousands of men in arms and armor who were with Henry, but he didn't have thousands of men. And as for the arms and armor, most of it is wood or fabric painted as metal. We never notice.
And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the metal of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not, for there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, training upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England and St. George!
And then the tension bursts, the music fanfare sounds, and we have this explosion of activity. And some comical asides from Ancient Pistol and the late Sir John Falstaff's friends and hangers-on. Robert Newton really became a star out of this picture, based on his comical abilities, which hadn't been exploited before.
God's vessels drop and die, and sword and shield in bloody field boast win immortal fame.
There on the left, by the way, is a future star, George Cole, as a boy. Cole later became a familiar figure on stage and screen for his lovable Cockney roles, most notably as Flash Harry, the larcenous but good-natured habitué of the St. Trinian School in the Frank Launder, Sidney Gilliat Bells of St. Trinians and its various sequels. Unfortunately, Cole's character doesn't have much of a speech here, simply an aside in which he states the character flaws of Bardolph, Pistol, and Nym, and abandons their company. Note the painted backdrops here and elsewhere in the exterior sequences in this part of the film. Olivier didn't want realism to intrude too far into any scene where it wouldn't enhance the action of the play. It also retains the look of a medieval painting. That's Michael Shepley playing Captain Gower. He was primarily a theater actor known for playing buffoons. Captain Llewellyn, seated on the left, is played by Esmond Knight, an actor best known for his work in the movies of Powell and Pressburger. He spent 20 years of his career appearing in pictures ranging from Contraband to Peeping Tom, even after losing his eyesight during British action against the German battleship Bismarck. This section of the play is an interesting Shakespearean look at the permutations of the British character, what we would call ethnic stereotypes, the Welshman commenting on the Scotsman and the Irish.
As much in his beard. He has no more directions in the true disciplines of the wars, look you, of the Roman disciplines, than is a puppy dog.
Here he comes. And the Scots captain, Captain Jamie with him.
Ah, Captain Jamie is a marvelous, valorous gentleman, that is certain, of great expeditions and knowledge in the ancient wars.
Captains Jamie and McMorris are played by a pair of top actors. John Laurie, playing Captain Jamie, had a 40-year career. He was the larcenous crofter in Hitchcock's The 39 Steps and the island patriarch in Powell's Edge of the World. But he became a television star in his 70s during the 1960s as one of the pensioners pressed into service in the defense of England during World War II in the series Dad's Army. Niall McGuinness, as the moody, fiery Captain McMorris, was one of Ireland's most talented actors on stage or screen. He starred in movies like Powell's Edge of the World and 49th Parallel. The character of Captain Jamie may well be a reference to James I of Scotland. The Scottish king was imprisoned by Henry IV, but released during his son's reign as a knight and served with great honor in Henry V's campaign in France. And Captain McMorris is the first known example we have in English theatre of the stage Irishman. Tongue-tied, moody, fiercely nationalistic, which is why Shakespeare included McMorris's lamentation over the command to break off the attack while there is throats to be cut and work to be done. It's strange to think that with this play, perhaps, begins a procession of Irish stereotypes that runs right up to the early 20th century ethnic portrayals in works like The Coens and the Kellys and Abbey's Irish Rose. Incidentally, the character of Captain Gower may have been Shakespeare's tribute to Thomas Gower, a soldier who served with distinction in Henry's army. And Captain Llewellyn is thought by some scholars to be a reference either to Sir Roger Williams, a Welsh soldier who served with the Earl of Essex in the 1580s and 1590s, or, less likely, to Ludovic Lloyd, a Welsh poet and courtier allied with Sir Christopher Hatton, Elizabeth's Lord Chancellor. The reference to Ireland here, and to Sir Roger Williams, would fit in with another topical element of the play. Shakespeare refers directly elsewhere in the play to the Irish military expedition of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He embarked for Ireland on March 27, 1599, and returned in defeat on September 28th of that year. We're able to place the writing of the play between those two dates. Henry V is as rich a pageant of Elizabethan history as it is of Henry's campaign. The history play became an extremely popular genre in the 1590s because the Elizabethans felt, collectively, that they had achieved something extraordinary, stability, after decades of threats from foreign enemies and domestic insurrection. It was a time to take stock of themselves and learn about and celebrate the English past. Henry V did both. This is the most stylized shot in the entire movie, the surrender of Harfleur to Henry and his army in his first major victory. This is pure medieval perspective and design brought to Technicolor film. There's also a major cut in this scene. In the play, Henry threatens Harfleur with pillage and destruction and the rape and defilement of the defender's daughters, the beheading of old men, and your naked infants spitted unto pikes, whiles the mad mothers with their howls confused do break the clouds, as did the wives of Jewry at Herod's bloody hunting slaughtermen. What say you? Will you yield and this avoid, or, guilty in defense, be thus destroyed? Olivier makes Henry far less bloodthirsty, in keeping with 20th century sensibilities.
Use mercy to them all. For us, dear brother, the winter coming on and sickness growing upon our soldiers, We will retire to Calais.
Henry seems very gentle and reflective here, which was a far cry from reality, a reality that I'll discuss later in more detail. This is an example of Shakespeare's and, more importantly, Olivier's poetic license with history. And now the movie, in an almost pastoral mood echoed by the most lyrical passages of William Walton's score, gives us our first glimpse of Catherine, the princess whom Henry will marry. Olivier got almost everyone and everything he asked for in making Henry V, within the limits of wartime rationing and restrictions. Mostly he did this by taking the production to Ireland, which was not at war, and by convincing British authorities that the film was an important contribution to the war effort. But this scene shows one thing that he did not get: his own wife in the movie. It was Olivier's intention that Vivien Leigh play Catherine, and she was eager to do it. They had only appeared in a single movie together while they were married, That Hamilton Woman, and she very much wished to do another, but it was not to be. Vivien Leigh was under exclusive contract to David O. Selznick, growing out of her work in Gone with the Wind. Selznick often had good instincts about film, and recognized the worth of a movie beyond its obvious commercial appeal. He was one of those who urged that the uncut Magnificent Ambersons be preserved, but his instincts failed him on Henry V. Seeing that Catherine only had 2 scenes, this one, in which she endeavors to learn English, and the courtship scene at the end, he refused to permit his biggest female star to appear in so small a role. And so, Olivier got 23-year-old Renée Ascherson, a gifted stage actress who performed superbly in her first screen appearance. Ironically, not only did Vivien Leigh never get to do another movie with her husband, but she never did another movie for Selznick after Gone with the Wind. And Renée Ascherson, fine as she was in this movie, chose to remain primarily a stage actress, with Henry V a major footnote to a career that has continued into the 1990s, 50 years later. Ascherson is one of those unusual performers whose career and life bridge 2 halves of a century. She was still working as of 1998, 54 years after Henry V, and has appeared in more than a dozen movies. But for the most part, she represents a working theatrical acting tradition that is often overlooked in a world where film dominates. She first established herself in the same Birmingham repertory company where, decades earlier, Robert Newton had begun his career. Her first big hit came in 1940 as Catherine Howard in The Rose Without a Thorn. She made her stage debut at age 15 in 1935 in a walk-on part in John Gielgud's production of Romeo and Juliet. Her other Shakespearean roles include Anne Page in The Merry Wives of Windsor, Bianca and later Desdemona in Othello, and Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. With the Birmingham Repertory Company, she played Amanda in George Bernard Shaw's final play, The Apple Cart, a play, incidentally, that I'm surprised isn't revived more often, since, as a satire about the political crisis that ensues when peace breaks out in Europe, it has meaning today. And she played Guilan, the romantic interest in Anouilh's Waltz of the Toreadors. Renée Ascherson was married to Robert Donat, incidentally. Like Ascherson, Donat was a performer who, having been presented several times over with the chance for international screen stardom in The 39 Steps and Goodbye, Mr. Chips, chose the stage instead.
De signe, de fauteuil de com. Madame, c'est excellent. C'est assez pour une fois. Allons-nous à dîner.
Look at these sets. It's as though the 2 women have stepped into a medieval painting. This was a necessity. Olivier did not have a lot of money to spend, given the sheer size of the production he was undertaking, so the use of elaborate, fully realized sets was out of the question. He wanted to give the movie, especially in this section, a compelling and memorable look, without blowing his budget, Hollywood-style, on expensive sets. It's interesting to compare Henry V with another major film that was going into production just as Henry was opening, Gabriel Pascal's Caesar and Cleopatra, based on Shaw's play, and starring Claude Rains and Vivien Leigh. Pascal spared no expense on his sets, spent £2 million, and came up with a movie that didn't look and was not half as memorable as Henry V. Ah, another vision right out of religious painting of the period. You have to love the Last Supper motif in the center of the screen here. The shots are amazing. No one else could or would have gotten away with making a movie that looked like this, with an image like this. Henry V is not just an Elizabethan film, as Neil MacDonald described it, but also a medieval film, a 15th century film at times. It was very much the precursor to Eric Rohmer's Parsifal, which uses some of the same kinds of medieval imagery and texture in its images. We're about to move into what is essentially the last distinct stylistic section of the movie. Olivier was very careful not to distract audiences from the essentials of Shakespeare's play, even as he kept the camera in Henry V so active as to continually delight and surprise the viewer. He and his collaborators made the play's opening into a realistic enactment of an Elizabethan performance. The middle of the film presented the story visually as it might have been handed down from Henry's own time, with Shakespeare providing the words, of course. And the final section is a realistic portrayal of the action in Shakespeare's play. It is estimated that within 6 months of its opening in England, some 2 million people had seen Henry V. That's an astonishing figure for a film released in the middle of a war, in a nation that had only 40 million people, many of whom were serving overseas defending the empire at the time. But it isn't so surprising when you try and imagine how people seeing this movie in 1944 and 1945 must have reacted, presented with all of the dazzling stylistic elements that we've seen just up to this point in the film. And the best was yet to come in terms of accessibility and popular appeal.
Prince Dauphin, you shall stay with us in Rouen.
Not so, I do beseech your majesty.
Station, you shall remain with us. Now forth, Lord Constable, and princes all, and quickly bring us word of England's fall.
Now we enter the last section of the film, with a dissolve, and we're on a battlefield. A real field with normal perspectives and populated by men in armor spread out as a real army would be. These scenes were the first shot for the film in the summer of 1943 in Ireland. There were 2 reasons to shoot in Ireland rather than England. First, it was cheaper, and second, it was possible in Ireland to get the wide-open spaces needed for the Agincourt section of the movie without any risk of combat aircraft intruding in the shot, because Ireland was neutral during the war. And the production got access to over 100 craftsmen needed to outfit the cinematic equivalent of Henry's army and their French opponents, and also to the horses and riders needed to recreate the armies. When you stop and think about the making of a movie like this during the middle of a war, it's astonishing. Everything was rationed, and for the services of all except the oldest actors and actresses, and access to any but the most common raw materials, Olivier was pretty much at the mercy of the government. Ireland provided the solution to those problems, too. This is a good time to talk a bit about how Henry V came about. For among the many firsts with which this movie can be credited, it has one attribute that is more extraordinary, if not as significant, as its Shakespearean and stylistic virtues than any other. Henry V was the first feature film to grow out of a television project. If you look at the credits for Henry V, you will notice an executive producer named Dallas Bauer. Bowers isn't a name that's too well known, except as it's attached to a number of unusual film projects that have found audiences. Big ones like Henry V, and small ones like the Lou Boonin puppetoon version of Alice in Wonderland from 1950. Bower originated the project of filming Henry V in 1937 when he was in charge of programming for the BBC's television unit. The BBC had begun experimental television broadcasts in 1933, and by 1937 were following a regular schedule, a few hours each day. Lord knows how many receivers there were in England at the time, but if it was more than 500, it would be astonishing. Bower came to the BBC and was put in charge of its television programming after a stint in movies. One of the films on which he'd worked as a production assistant was Paul Zinner's As You Like It. This was a movie on which very little had gone very right, but among the little that had was the work of its male lead, Laurence Olivier, as Orlando, and the music written by an up-and-coming composer named William Walton, who was already achieving recognition in musical circles. It was Bower's other significant contribution to Henry V to recommend Walton to compose the score. In 1937, the BBC had inaugurated a series of Friday night broadcasts called Scenes from Shakespeare, which did individual scenes from the plays. They'd done the courtship scene from Henry V, which was rather logical since it involves only 3 actors. Bower proposed doing a full-length broadcast of Henry V, but this was deemed beyond the BBC's capabilities or budget. And then, with the coming of war to Europe in 1939, the television unit was shut down and its technical staff assigned to work on radar defense. The BBC's television broadcasts might have reached precious few people, but the same technology was vital to the development of a radar net, which proved absolutely decisive during the Battle of Britain. After the BBC closed down its television division, Bower went to work as an executive at the Ministry of Information. He never gave up on the idea of a full-length Henry V production, seeing it not only as a worthwhile project in its own right, but as potentially a very effective propaganda film. For many in the industry, this notion was a stretch, especially in 1940-41, when Bower started pushing the idea. After all, from one point of view, Henry starts a war by invading a neighboring country for base economic and domestic political reasons, and justifies his action using an ancient territorial claim. All of this made Henry perhaps seem a bit too much like Adolf Hitler. A bit about this scene. The Constable of France was played by Leo Guin, one of the actors that Olivier had to borrow from the military. He had been a lawyer by profession before becoming an actor, and was a lieutenant colonel in the infantry when he was borrowed for the film. This scene, and the contrasting one in the English camp, is an important Shakespearean device. One gets something similar in Richard III in the contrasting speeches by Richard and Henry Tudor. The parallelism intended to delineate the differences between the two sides. The foppish Dauphin here brags about his horse, while Henry, in the English camp, is involved with his men. Getting back to the film's origins, the Ministry of Information simply couldn't comprehend the notion of a film of any Shakespeare play having any relevancy to the war effort. They were supposed to be making short films about air raid procedures, guarding against fifth columnists, and keeping secrets from the enemy, not retailing tales of 500-year-old battles. In the spring of 1942, Bower produced a radio show of patriotic performances, which included 2 of Henry's rousing speeches read by Laurence Olivier. Bower approached Olivier, whom he hadn't seen since As You Like It, and broached the idea of doing a film of Henry V. Olivier was willing to consider the idea, but he had no resources with which to make such a movie. Indeed, Olivier was rather strapped for cash at the time, owing to another Shakespeare project. He had produced and directed a theatrical version of Romeo and Juliet with his wife, Vivien Leigh, that closed after only 36 performances. By 1942, Olivier was serving in the Fleet Air Arm, the British Seaborne Flying Force, but he was regularly released from service in order to perform in radio and film productions that were deemed important to the war effort. During the fall of 1942, Dallas Bauer made contact with producer Filippo del Giudice almost simultaneously with his hearing Olivier in the role of Henry in a radio broadcast. Giudice was an attorney in Rome whose anti-fascist politics forced him to exit Italy in 1932. He then settled in London, gradually learning enough English to survive and even teach before returning to the legal profession. Giudice's specialty was international law, and one of the cases that he advised on introduced him to the movie business. He eventually found some backers and set up a company called Two Cities, through which he produced a picture called French Without Tears. The film was a success, and Two Cities was launched. It was also the film that first teamed art director Paul Sheriff and designer Carmen Dillon together. They were later at the heart of Henry V's production team. The movie was also edited by David Lean, who would loom large in Giudice's future. That was in 1939. Then the war broke out in September of that year, and Giudice was interned as an enemy alien because of his Italian citizenship. He was released quickly and went back into production. His first film was one of my favorites growing up, an espionage thriller set in London called Unpublished Story. The next movie from Giudice's company was David Lean and Noel Coward's In Which We Serve. Giudice liked Bauer's idea of doing Henry V. He began pondering the problem of finding a leading man. Then he happened to hear a radio broadcast by Olivier of the Once More Into the Breach speech, and later met him on the opening night of In Which We Serve, where Giudice brought up the idea of doing Henry V. Olivier was willing to pursue the project if Giudice could find the financing. But he was also gun-shy about Shakespeare after his experience with As You Like It. Olivier was only willing to do Henry V if he controlled the production, which Giudice agreed to. In the meantime, Olivier was released from war service to do the Demi-Paradise for Two Cities. That film was considered important to the war effort. Olivier played a Soviet scientist who was visiting London during the war. Olivier set about putting the production together. This included not only designers and artists, but the cinematographer and a director. That's right, Olivier wasn't his own first choice as a director of Henry V. He wasn't even his second or third choice. Oh, and here we're in an important scene, cinematically and dramatically. Henry, as the chorus tells us, moves among his men, an example of true nobility in contrast to the Dauphin's aristocratic remove and haughty demeanor. It is in this scene that we learn the use to which Henry put his early adult life among the low-born and the rabble surrounding Sir John Falstaff. From those days he understands, more deeply than any king would be expected to, what drives the common soldier in his army. And he wrestles with his own fears as well. He is not the fop and playboy that the Dauphin called him in his message at the play's outset. He is not the shallow, aimless youth that the French court believes him to be.
Glory on his head. For forth he goes and visits all his host, bids them good morrow with a modest smile, and calls them brothers, friends, and countrymen. A largesse universal, like the sun, his liberal eye doth give to everyone, thawing cold fear, that mean and gentle all, behold, as may unworthiness define, a little touch of Harry in the night.
Parenthetically, if anyone wonders why the royalty of Shakespeare's time, particularly the Queen and her immediate circle, loved these plays, it was more than the fact that he chronicled the march of English history in a way that made the Lancasters and the Tudors heroes. Shakespeare made their ancestors and predecessors on the throne so complex that it was like discovering a family portrait that seemed to come alive right there in the room. Here, Henry shares a joke at the expense of his dignity with an elder nobleman. Later, he will move among his men and hear their fears that if the king is captured, he will ransom himself and forget about them. And we hear his vow, no ransom. He shares their fate. Of course, the problem with this dramatic bond between king and commoner is that in reality, the common soldier or sailor in Elizabethan times was treated just about as badly as in Henry's time, nearly 200 years earlier. It's seldom mentioned in history classes, for example, that when Elizabeth's navy defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, she was faced with a problem. The treasury had no money left at the end of that war with which to pay the sailors, which would have to be done once they were released from their ships. So she left them there, bottled up in port aboard ship until there was money. And in the course of keeping them there, disease and starvation killed thousands of them, naturally lightening the payroll somewhat. Ah, the king crosses paths with ancient Pistol, and we get a glimpse of Pistol's prejudices, and by contrast, Henry's lack of them. Pistol calls the men beneath him base and common, with scorn in his tone worthy of the Dauphin, except that Pistol doesn't know any better, being more base and common himself than any other character in this movie. There's a veiled topical reference here in the play as well. Henry's saying that he's a Welshman. The Tudors' ancestry was Welsh, Shakespeare's point being to identify the heroic 15th century king with the current reigning monarch. There's an important cut here also. In the play, Bardolph is hanged for stealing. Somehow, in a film as opposed to a play, and in this century, it just didn't seem to add anything to the appeal of the material that a character we've met and rather liked is executed for what amounts to petty theft. Henry then moves among more honorable men. Getting back to the production and Olivier's search for a director, he initially approached William Wyler, who was one of America's top directors and had brought plays such as The Children's Hour and Dodsworth to the screen successfully. He was serving with the Allied forces in England, so he was available. Wyler turned Olivier down, saying that he wasn't familiar enough or sufficiently comfortable with Shakespeare to do justice to the project. Olivier approached Carol Reed, who had made a few successful small-scale movies before the war. But Reed turned him down, suggesting instead Terence Young, an up-and-coming writer-turned-director with whom he'd worked. But Young was commanding a tank unit in North Africa and was unable to accept Olivier's offer. Finally, and very reluctantly, Olivier decided to direct the movie himself, spurred on by Giudice, who had complete confidence in his leading man's ability behind the camera. In fact, Olivier had very little confidence in his own ability to pull the film together as producer and director. He chose Reginald Beck, who was editing The Demi-Paradise, as his editor. Dallas Bauer's script was utterly unusable as far as Olivier was concerned. It would have to be rewritten, but as Bauer had been responsible for originating the project, he was kept on in the production as associate producer. For the preparation of the script, Olivier turned to Alan Dent, a Shakespeare scholar who was the lead theatre critic for the London News Chronicle. As it turned out, Dent had already been working with Henry V, preparing a new edition of the play for publication. With Olivier and Beck assisting, he turned his attention to a screenplay version. Olivier brought in Roger First and his sister Margaret as costume designers. He knew their work from the theatre. The choice of a cinematographer was particularly inspired, though it didn't seem so at the time. Robert Krasker, who was born in Perth, Australia in 1913, had begun his career in France before moving to England in 1930. He had served as camera operator at Alexander Korda's London Films and on several visually impressive movies, including Drums, The Four Feathers, The Thief of Baghdad, and Rembrandt, possibly the best cinematic biography of an artist ever done, and a movie in which the visuals tended to echo the work of its subject. He had only begun working as a cinematographer in 1943, however, and had never shot anything in Technicolor himself. Ah, but this is an important scene.
The violet smells to him as it doth to me. His ceremony is laid by, in his nakedness he appears but a man. Therefore, when he sees reasons of fears as we do, his fears without doubt be of the same relish as ours are. Yet no man should find in him any appearance of fear, lest he, by showing it, should dishearten his army.
He may show what outward courage he will. But I believe, as cold and ice it is,
He'd wish himself in Thames up to the neck. So I would he were, and I buy him at all adventures, so he were quit here.
By my troth, I will speak my conscience of the king. I think he would not wish himself anywhere but where he is.
Then I would he were here alone. So should he be sure to be ransomed, and a many poor men's lives saved.
Methinks I would not die anywhere so contented as in the king's company. His cause being just, and his quarrel honorable.
It's more than we know.
Aye. Or more than we should seek after. For we know enough if we know we are the king's subjects. If his cause be wrong, our obedience to the king wipes the crime of it out of us.
But if the cause be not good, the king himself hath a heavy reckoning to make, when all those legs and arms and heads, chopped off in a battle, shall join together at the latter day, and cry all, "We died at such a place." Some swearing, some crying for a surgeon, some upon their wives left poor behind them, some upon the debts they owe, some upon their children rawly left. I'm afraid there are few die well that die in a battle, for how can they charitably dispose of anything when blood is their argument? Now, if these men do not die well, it'll be a black matter for the king that led them to it.
This dialogue is about as compelling a moral argument in terms of the rights and responsibilities of kings and queens in Elizabethan terms as you will find in any of Shakespeare's works.
If a son that is by his father sent upon merchandise to sinfully miscarry upon the sea, the imputation of his wickedness by your rule should be imposed upon his father that sent him. But this is not so. The king is not bound to answer for the particular endings of his soldiers, nor the father of his son. For they purpose not their deaths when they purpose their services. Every subject's duty is the king's, but every subject's soul is his own.
That is certain. Every man that dies ill, the ill's on his own head. King's not to answer for it.
I do not desire he should answer for me. And yet I determined to fight lustily for him.
I myself heard the king say he would not be ransomed.
He said so to make us fight cheerfully. But when our throats are cut, he may be ransomed, and we ne'er the wiser.
If I live to see it, I'll never trust his word after.
That's a perilous shot out of a pop gun that a poor and private displeasure can do against a monarch.
This is an astonishingly sophisticated piece of writing in any century. It was an ideal of English nobility that was expressed here in a more poignant, moving, and intellectually challenging manner than any of Shakespeare's contemporaries ever could. As it happens, this entire scene in the camp at night is considered by many the best in the play and the film, perhaps because it is one of the quietest and requires a good deal more than a loud voice and imposing gestures to work. Here was another change that Olivier made, by the way.
Upon the king, let us our lives, our souls, our debts, our careful wives, our children, and our sins lay on the king. We must bear all. What infinite heart's ease must kings forego that private men enjoy?
These lines are written as a soliloquy, but instead of a soliloquy, they're presented as a voiceover. A soliloquy like this may seem artificial today, but in Shakespeare's own time, as with all of his other words, it would have been the center of what was a very uncluttered stage. The richness of Shakespeare's work in just about every respect is a constant source of awe, of course. It has been pointed out that one of the advantages that Shakespeare had in terms of achieving this richness of expression lay in the time in which he did his work. He had a brilliant dramatic mind, of course, and a dazzling sense of his audience and where he could lead them and challenge their expectations. But it was also important that Shakespeare did his work before the advent of the novel as a vehicle for literary and intellectual expression. Rather, he worked in an era in which much of this expression was still aimed at and intended for group audiences. The spareness of his stage was a virtue. He could put these ideas forth in his dramas without the distractions of elaborate stage effects, or, in the context of the novel, the need to create a wholly detailed, fully formed literary environment. His stage was an extension of his world and the world of his audience, a group or communal experience into which he could introduce, explore, and dissect ideas. And so we get a debate involving law, morality, and theology on his stage. That it's still accessible and compelling, even in an era of rampant democracy 400 years later, lies with the quality of the expression. During the shoot, incidentally, Krasker proved a genius at using Technicolor, exploiting the medium's rich textures and depth in the scenes at the French court, but also its subtleties in the night scenes. As with all Technicolor films of this era, there was a consultant assigned to the film who was supposed to advise the cinematographer. Krasker ignored this advice, particularly in the scene before Agincourt in the pre-dawn, when the lighting levels were brought down astonishingly low. It was probably the most subtle and muted use of Technicolor ever seen in a commercial film release up to this time. You weren't supposed to use Technicolor this way, but Krasker did. Now we can return for a moment to the background of the production of the film. Production began in early January of 1943. Dallas Bauer secured the releases of the needed actors and artists and technicians. Roger Furse, who had first met Olivier socially at the home of the actress Gladys Cooper some years earlier, when both were just making their names in theater, was serving on a cruiser in the Royal Navy as a signalman. He was only too happy to be released to the production, the first film he ever worked on. His sister Margaret joined the company with him. Leo Genn and Robert Newton were the others released. Leslie Banks, Felix Aylmer, and the rest of the cast were people that Olivier had worked with in the past, either in film or theater, and with whom he felt comfortable. Actually, Henry V was not the first Shakespeare play Olivier had considered filming. He'd thought of trying to film Richard III, which he'd done on stage, but he was advised that in the middle of a war, a story about members of the royal family conspiring against each other for the crown would not help morale or create much good feeling for England abroad. And then Bauer had come along with the idea of doing Henry. It would be 11 years before he would get to do Richard III. By early 1943, the Henry V production was also getting real support from the government. The Ministry of Information now saw the value of the movie. The difference was that the war had entered a new phase. Although there were still terrible German air attacks, it was clear that these weren't going to shatter the island nation. Additionally, with the Americans now fully in the war and some victories under the belts of the Allies on the battlefield, it was clear that at some point there was going to be an invasion of the continent. And it now seemed that retelling a story of England's last successful invasion of the continent had some virtues. We did it once in an even more mismatched battle, and we could do it again, was the underlying message behind this film of Henry V. Though this message was understood by the participants, there were naysayers, especially among the critics, who hated the film because they couldn't get past the notion that it depicted the British making war against their ostensible allies, the French. One critic even raised the question of whether it would ever be a favorite of General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French. After the war, it was passed by French censors, and Henry V did extremely well in France. It seems that French audiences were able to look past the depiction of the French nobles and the battles, focusing instead on the look of the film as a celebration of France's artistic heritage. Here we get another contrast between the French and the British. The French prepare for the battle joyfully, confidently.
Oh, brave spirit! We are winning there in the world! Hark how our steeds
Knights for present service, nay.
Mount them and make incision in their hides, that their hot blood may spin in English eyes, and quench them with superior courage. Ah,
The English are embattled, you French peers.
What's more, you couldn't ask for a better piece of scoring than Walton's music here. The orchestra exultant, surging forth boldly, horns and strings at full cry. The French go to their mounts in their heavy suits of armor. Olivier had to have visualized all of this and how the battle could be filmed from the outset. He knew of one recent film whose plot had hinged on a battle involving knights on the scale of Agincourt, and he studied that film closely, watching it over and over to see how it had been done. And that film was Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky. Curiously, Nevsky was also a propaganda film, made with the support of the Soviet government, recalling medieval Russia's successful repelling of an army of Teutonic knights. And the heavy armor worn by those knights is central to the outcome of that battle as they break through the ice of the frozen lake over which they charge. We're coming up on one of Shakespeare's greatest speeches, where Henry eloquently projects confidence and enthusiasm to his worried men despite the overwhelming odds. With a deft rhetorical touch, Shakespeare turns the odds against the English into an advantage. If they are doomed, they are a small enough loss for their country, their number being small. And if they are victorious, that victory will be all the more glorious. Some 205 years after Shakespeare wrote Henry V, American naval officer Stephen Decatur paraphrased Henry's speech. He was about to lead a group of men ashore in Tripoli, the stronghold of the Barbary pirates. Decatur, speaking of the size of his tiny raiding party, remarked, "The fewer the men, the greater the glory."
This day is called the Feast of Crispin. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispin. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, "Tomorrow is St. Crispin." Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, "These wounds I had on Crispin's day." Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember, with advantages, what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son. And Crispin shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so base. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day.
This scene illustrates the wisdom of Olivier's decision to pull the camera back during these speeches. We get a view of a significant chunk of the English forces, yes, and he makes grand gestures emphasizing his words and intent. But equally important, he can raise his voice. Olivier, according to Harry Goddard, had noticed that in earlier movies of this type, as the camera moved in on the speaker during the speeches, there was a tendency for the actor to lower his voice even if the speech required the reverse. Pulling the camera back solved that problem. This is the most conventionally realistic part of the film. The eye for historical detail here is no less sharp than it is in the Globe Playhouse scenes. The preparations, the French knights being mounted on their horses. This is the sort of detail that might easily have been overlooked, since it isn't in the play, of course. but it allows Olivier to make the film a true expansion and extension of the play, showing what the chorus asks us to imagine. These battle scenes had two very specific models. One was Uccello's 15th century painting, The Rout of San Romano. The other was Sergei Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky. The influences are obvious if you compare the two movies. Alexander Nevsky had been made in 1937, actually for purposes that were remarkably similar to those that yielded Henry V in England 6 years later. Nevsky was made as a morale-boosting film under the auspices of the Soviet government. At the time, the Soviets were fearful of a potential attack by Nazi Germany. The screenwriters looked back to a 13th century invasion of Russia by Teutonic Knights as a basis for reminding the Soviet people that they'd beaten the Germans back once and could do it again. In fact, in its original screenplay draft, the Teutonic Knights displayed swastika emblems on their armor. Those swastikas disappeared in the final film, but the similarities between the helmets of the Teutonic infantry and the modern German infantry were impossible to ignore. Nevsky was an immediate hit in and outside of the Soviet Union. In fact, it was Eisenstein's first popular film in many years and was widely seen. As it happens, stylistically, it was different from anything that came before it in Eisenstein's output, with an epic, almost operatic approach, which was further emphasized by the presence of Prokofiev's music, which included the presence of a full chorus. I should point out that Olivier is wearing some of the little armor that he actually had available. He discovered that not only was there barely enough medieval-style armor of this kind available, but that wartime priorities for metal prevented the forging of all but the most essential pieces. The chainmail on most of the troops was merely cloth sprayed with aluminum. What Roger first did to divert people's attentions from the fact that most of the armor was painted wood was to come up with the brightest banners that he could, to draw the eye. This was a variation, almost a reversal really, of an element of medieval painting, where bright colors such as red and gold were used to draw the viewer's eye to what was important. This is another famous speech. Henry declares publicly the thoughts that he conveyed to a handful of men in his walk through the camp at night, here in grand, heroic terms.
Time hath worn us into slovenly, but by the mass our hearts are in the trim. Aye. Come now no more for ransom, gentle herald. They shall have none, I swear, but these my bones, which if they have, as I will leave them, shall yield them little. Tell the constable. I shall, King.
Heroic expression of this kind was seldom heard from medieval kings. It was customary in the Middle Ages for a warrior king to be ransomed back to his people, ensuring his own survival even as his men were usually killed in battle. But Henry says here that there will be no ransom. If he loses, the French may keep him, all intended to inspire his men. Hearing it during World War II, filmgoers would immediately have thought of King George VI, the current King of England, and his family, remaining in London during the Battle of Britain and the threatened invasion of England. Now, for these scenes, except for a couple of shots, Olivier didn't really borrow the look of Nevsky, which had a kind of raw savagery despite its epic nature. The major exceptions were these shots of the French cavalry's approach, which mimicked the approach of the Teutonic Knights in Alexander Nevsky. Henry V was, necessarily, due to its origins, more poetic and lyrical, even in these scenes. But Olivier drew on the rhythms of the editing and the relationships between the shots. These shots of the charge of the French knights again replicate the German knights' attack in Nevsky. There are particulars about the battle that make Henry V different, however. The archers here are vastly important. The drawing and holding of the bows, coupled with the quickening pace and ever more urgent content of Walton's music, set up immense tension for the viewer. Olivier holds these shots for an amazingly long time. He did this with a most extraordinary camera setup. A track like a railroad track was prepared on the Powers Court estate in Ireland, running a half a mile on a farm road adjoining this field, and onto this a camera dolly was affixed. It took several tries to get it right. The dolly jerked visibly and the motion wasn't smooth. At points, the camera lost the riders who were supposed to be the central focus of the shot, but ultimately Olivier got what he wanted, a tracking shot running a full minute, uncut, of the French knights on horseback charging at a full gallop. There's no undercranking here. This charge is filmed at actual speed. The editing here is modeled on the Odessa Steppe sequence in Battleship Potemkin. When Walton wrote the score, however, he used Nevsky as his model. The music's increasing pitch matched the cuts and rhythm of the editing of the film. This shot is duplicated from Nevsky, except that the Irish countryside in Technicolor is more appealing. The sword drops, the arrows fly, and the tension is broken. Those arrows and their flight made a major impression. I don't think anything like this had ever shown up in a popular movie before, as they go up and hang there in midair, and then begin their downward arc into the attacking French forces. When the movie was reissued in the late 1950s, reconfigured into Superscope, it meant that the new prints had the top and bottom of the original Academy ratio images cropped. Some people resented that the tops of heads were cut off, but the most grievous loss was the impact of that phalanx of arrows. At least one critic at the time complained, because this meant that in the reissue, the arrows go out of shot before reaching the top of their arc, and then reappear on their downward arc. It spoiled the effect. Now, I'd like to digress a little bit here from the film itself, and even the play, to some of the history behind what was written and seen. There's a reality lurking behind Henry V that's often forgotten. Shakespeare may not have appreciated it or understood it entirely, but the events that he wrote about at Agincourt marked the end of an era in warfare. More than that, they were a major part of a process by which politics and government were redefined, and they had a profound effect on the shape of history. The fact is that the French knights in their heavy armor, like their Teutonic counterparts of the earlier century in Alexander Nevsky, were holdovers from a bygone era. They'd outlived much of their effectiveness, but nobody was prepared at the time to say so until Agincourt. Armored knights on horseback were formidable in the early Middle Ages. Even then, there were ways to combat them. Specially trained dogs, the dogs of war quite literally, wearing spiked collars and bred for savagery, were used to attack and injure their horses, knocking the knights to the ground where they were helpless off their feet. Incidentally, Olivier was injured jumping out of a tree to demonstrate how the English should fall on the French knights. His ankle and both arms were sprained. He was also hurt while directing. He was looking through a viewfinder preparing a shot when a horse panicked and bolted for the camera, cutting a deep gash in Olivier's lip right down to the gum. Getting back to the historical realities, it was the longbow that made it easy and inexpensive to battle knights in armor, and few were better at using longbows than the English. Under Edward III in the 13th century, the English had invaded France and used their bows to great effect. It wasn't that armies didn't use foot soldiers, but if there were foot soldiers, they were no more than auxiliary forces, secondary to the knights, and often men tied to the estates of those knights and under the command of individual nobles. Strategy was built around the knight in armor. Now, armies structured along those lines were expensive to maintain and inevitably involved the cooperation of members of the nobility who had large forces as well as large amounts of money to contribute to any war. Bows and their accompanying arrows were inexpensive to make. Men could be taught the rudiments of aiming and shooting in short order, and if you massed enough men together, you created a phalanx of arrows that could cut an oncoming army, however they were armored, to pieces. This scene is interesting in a subtle way. The French knights, shocked and outraged by their impending rout, attacked the unarmed British camp, slaying the boys left there, all but the Dauphin and his herald, who hesitates to join in the slaughter. He may be the useless, idle royal fop, but he does understand right and wrong. Returning again to the realities of history, at the very least, archers neutralized the infantry that rode with the knights. For over 100 years, the two different schools of warfare clashed, in a stalemate that gradually went in favor of the bowmen. They were simply cheaper to maintain, and the crown or any rebel force could afford to pay those men directly. The Battle of Agincourt decided the matter once and for all. It was the last major battle fought in Europe in which armored knights played a dominant role on either side. Agincourt introduced a newly successful brand of warfare, infantry warfare, and Henry V was, in many respects, the first fully successful modern infantry commander and the distant precursor to men like Ulysses S. Grant and Marshal Zhukov. Here, in these scenes, we're seeing something more subtle than that, however. The emphasis in Shakespeare's play on the captains and the fact that Henry communicates with those captains reflects the democratization of warfare. Henry has his knights and nobles riding with him and providing men, but it is the common men, the captains who are not nobles, and the ordinary archers, and even these boys, as well as larcenous rogues like Pistol, Bardolph, and Nym, who do most of the fighting for the English.
I was not angry since I came to France, until this instant.
Here's another opposition between Henry and the Dauphin. The Dauphin runs from the battlefield, having failed to command his own men honorably. Henry rides to the battlefield, an avenging angel, in reaction to the same base, dishonorable act. The mere fact that Henry knows his captains speaks to the kind of king he was, or that Shakespeare, and certainly Olivier, wanted Henry to be. This scene of single combat was drawn in part from Nevsky. Getting back to Henry's historical reality, Agincourt showed how a king or queen could raise an effective army themselves with relatively little expense. But where did that leave the nobles? The whole concept of nobility and titles and the influence of nobles at court changed. Suddenly, their importance rested not with the armor or the size of the forces that they could offer a king, but with other skills in politics, finance, and other non-military pursuits. Knighthood and nobility, their usefulness in England, became much more of a political matter. War and combat gradually evolved into more purely a matter of state to be decided by kings. This subtlety may be lost on us today, but by taking war and its prosecution out of the hands of feudal lords and putting it more securely in the hands of the king or government, the development of infantry warfare was a first step toward including the people in the decision to wage war. And as the people gained rights and the crown lost authority over the ensuing 500 years, history ultimately arrived at the concept, embodied in the Constitution of the United States, that only the duly elected representatives of the people can commit a country or its people to war. At the same time, it democratized war, making the common foot soldier a deadly threat, and changed the nature of combat. Individual or small groups of bowmen and their arrows had the same effect on war in the 14th century that the bazooka or anti-tank shell had on tank warfare in World War II, or the Exocet missile had on naval warfare. Suddenly a weapon costing perhaps $100,000 could sink a warship costing tens of millions.
What is this castle called that stands hard by?
Walton's music shines here as Agincourt is commemorated.
Then call we this the field of Agincourt, fought on the day of Crispin Crispianus.
This is one of several instances in which Walton drew on traditional sources, although he owed a debt here to an older contemporary, Ralph Vaughan Williams. Vaughan Williams was the dean of 20th century English composers and England's dominant composer in the first half and middle of the century. In 1933, he had written music for a radio performance of Henry V, which included this traditional hymn. When Walton approached the scoring of Olivier's film, he turned to Vaughan Williams and adapted the same hymn with chorus for the film. Henry's was an astounding victory, won on October 25, 1415, one that stunned the French and the rest of Europe. An army of 10,000 Britons, many of them tired and sickly and most demoralized, defeated a force of 30,000 French, killing 10,000 of the enemy and losing only 500 men of their own. Returning to the time in which the film was made, Olivier could see the parallels with the coming invasion of Fortress Europe in making Henry V. And there were parallels with the modern conflict. The Germans had the heaviest tanks on the Western Front and expressed at least the same level of arrogance that the French in Henry V displayed. The longbow was the first weapon of mass assault in the modern sense, weapons that you could fire at a mass target. It was from the use of archers that we see here that, with mechanical invention, led to the Gatling gun, the machine gun, and other weapons that only had to be pointed in the general direction of an oncoming army. And even though Henry, in a scene that was devised entirely by Olivier and Dent for the film, defeats the Constable of France in a duel, Agincourt helped hasten the end of single combat and the end of chivalry. We fade out on a hymn provided by Walton out of the period of the battle itself. This was an odd matter for Walton, really, who was a decidedly modern composer from the first half of the 20th century. Henry V's music took on a life of its own on record and in the concert hall and became one of his most popular works, but it gave people the impression that he was, in a sense, another Vaughan Williams, heavily indebted to sources out of England's musical history. This was not the case, but it was an image from which he never entirely escaped, so popular was this score and his subsequent music for Olivier's Hamlet and Richard III. We now come to the aftermath of the battle in the village of Agincourt. It's an absolutely stunning sequence, and a very funny one as well. There's a glimpse of Pistol dallying with some local Frenchwoman. I would call your attention to this shot, however, in particular, as an almost exact reproduction of the February calendar page from the Duke of Berry's Book of Hours, which we have reproduced in the supplement to the film on this disc. I would strongly urge anyone watching to access that material, not only for the sheer beauty of the illuminated manuscript pages, but because they're such an extraordinary source of inspiration for a film's design and an art director's work. For decades after its release, Olivier maintained that he had tampered only minimally with the text of the play, and most film critics at the time assented to that view. This wasn't really true, however. In fact, according to Harry Godold, of the complete text of 3,199 lines, Olivier and Dent kept only 1,505, or less than half of the play. If you read the uncut play alongside the film, you would find that most of the cuts were made for the sake of clarity to a 20th century film audience. Shakespeare, as a successful playwright of his era, could assume certain facts and evidence, so to speak, within the consciousness of his audience. Knowledge about the kings of England and concepts of law, royal succession, and morality that playgoers would very likely have shared in the Elizabethan era. Olivier could make no such assumptions, thus much of this material had to go. This included anything that might make a viewer in 1944 or 1945 think of divisiveness. The play's references to the fact that Scotland may be a source of unrest that thwarts Henry's rule were removed, along with any reference to treason within the English ranks. And any of the actions that Shakespeare attributes to Henry that would no longer be considered morally acceptable had to come out. Elizabethans had very different concepts from ours, after all, of what constituted proper actions for a king, executing prisoners, for example, which Henry orders of his French captives in the play. These changes were necessities given the time and purpose for which Olivier was making his movie. It should also be recalled that filmmakers had felt compelled to alter and adapt Shakespeare's work in bringing it to the screen from the very earliest efforts to film Shakespeare. In 1899, Sir Herbert Beerbohm Tree, an actor, producer, and one of the leading theatrical lights of his day, was appearing in a West End production of Shakespeare's King John and filmed, apparently in part for his own entertainment, the Magna Carta scene from King John. Now, this was important for several reasons. The first was, of course, that this modest little 3-minute effort ushered in the era of film Shakespeare adaptations. The second reason for its importance, slightly less obvious, is that there is no Magna Carta scene in King John. Indeed, the Elizabethans didn't regard the signing of the Magna Carta as a major historical event. So this adaptation of King John also opened up the era of altering Shakespeare for the movies and tailoring his work to contemporary expectations and sensibilities. Next to pioneering efforts such as this, Olivier's changes in Henry V seem generally reasoned and thoughtful, although his film has caused offense on what might be called an ideological level in the decades since. What constitutes an acceptable propaganda film in time of war, a morale-boosting effort for troops and viewers at the home front, can later seem jingoistic and warmongering. This was evidently the thinking that informed some of the praise behind Kenneth Branagh's adaptation of Henry V. Many critics who embraced Branagh's more fierce and warlike interpretation of both the role of Henry and the play itself felt that Olivier had succeeded too well in his immediate purpose, that is, in glorifying war and justifying aggression. Branagh's Henry is more complex, although his may be a little too harsh. It puts a post-Vietnam spin on Shakespeare's play and Henry's exploits, making him a decided anti-hero, almost a villain. I sometimes think of the Branagh film as being the pacifist Henry V, Olivier's the old-fashioned patriot's version. Robert Newton's ancient pistol makes his exit. Little could Newton have realized with the shooting of these scenes that he was stepping into an entirely new career as a comedic and sometimes not-so-comedic rogue out of Henry V, after decades of straight dramatic parts. He'd delight millions as Blackbeard the Pirate and Long John Silver for Disney, and as Bill Sikes in David Lean's Oliver Twist. Now we're back in the French court, and here's a funny reversal on the opening of the movie. Notice the boys' choir in the foreground. We'll see them again as the film switches back to the Globe Playhouse. The melody that they're singing, by the way, comes from one of the songs of the Auvergne, adapted by Walton to this score. Now there's time to talk about the other people behind the film. Let's start with Giudice, whose role as overall producer of Henry V didn't end when Olivier started shooting. Olivier shot the Battle of Agincourt first in the summer of 1943, and then headed back to Denham Studios in England in September of that year. Shooting continued for almost 4 more months. The Agincourt scenes alone, however, had seemed to put the movie in jeopardy. Olivier's injuries had caused delays, and he'd had to reshoot more than 4 minutes of finished film when the technical inadequacies became apparent while viewing the rushes. Even viewing the rushes was fraught with peril. In those days, shooting in Technicolor only gave you access to rushes in hastily processed black and white, and Olivier was dismayed even by the look of what he had shot, forget the technical difficulties. He returned to Denham feeling doubtful and demoralized, and also pressured for time and money. The movie had been budgeted at £300,000, or around $1.25 million in the exchange rate that existed at the time. That would have made it among the more expensive films in production in England at the time, and would have put it in the top 10% of Hollywood productions. But the Agincourt sequences alone had used almost a third of the budget for hardly 30 minutes of a proposed 2-hour and 10-minute movie. Giudice saw the problem developing, but Two Cities Films could borrow no more money. He finally made a deal with the Rank organization, which was already contracted to distribute the movie. In exchange for the completion money, which ran close to $2 million, Giudice gave up ownership of the movie and control of his company to Rank. He sold his company to save Henry V. Giudice later produced The Way Ahead, Blythe Spirit, Odd Man Out, and Olivier's Hamlet. Later on in the 1940s, when the quality and scope of the Rank organization's output declined, he reclaimed Two Cities. He continued to produce movies until 1958, when he retired to a monastery. He died in 1961. The production designer for Henry V, responsible for the entire overall look of this most extraordinarily beautiful film, was Paul Sheriff. He had a most extraordinary life before ever entering the movie business. He was born Count Paul Shuvalov in Moscow in 1903. His grandfather, Count Peter Shuvalov, was the Tsar's ambassador to London in the 1880s. Had the revolution not come, he might well have had a career in politics or the diplomatic corps. He left Russia with the revolution, however, and settled in England, and was educated at Oxford and at the Combourne School of Mines. He took his new name when he became a British subject in the 1930s. His formal training was as an architect and mining engineer, but he had a special talent for design. He started a career as an art director and was an immediate success. He entered pictures with Dark Journey, an espionage film starring Vivian Leigh and Conrad Veidt, and came to the attention of Two Cities Films when he served as art director on French Without Tears. He was also the art director on Leslie Howard's First of the Few and Howard's production of The Gentle Sex, and then Henry V. Sheriff was the guiding hand behind much of the look of Henry, in conjunction with Robert Krasker, the cinematographer. In 1948, 2 years after Henry V opened in America, Sheriff was honored with an award from a group of New York critics for his work on the film. He also later won an Oscar for his work as art director on John Huston's Moulin Rouge in 1953. And American filmgoers got to know Sheriff's work well through The Crimson Pirate, a swashbuckler spoof starring Burt Lancaster. Paul Sheriff was designated as production designer on Henry V, but he was one of 3 people responsible for the movie's visual style. The others were Carmen Dillon, who was Sheriff's assistant, and Roger First, the costume designer, whose career I've already described. Officially, First was the costume designer, assisted by his sister Margaret, but in a film like this, and especially in the scenes in the French court, costumes accounted for more than their usual share of the film's overall look. Carmen Dillon was more than Sheriff's associate in Henry V, whatever the credits read. She was his collaborator, decorating the sets that he designed, everything from furnishings and draperies to the banners in the French court sequences that draw our eyes toward what we're supposed to be watching. Dillon was not only a unique talent, but a unique figure in British films, the only woman art director working in the British movie industry from the 1930s until the 1960s. She was born in London in 1908 and was trained as an architect. That work failed to satisfy her, however, and she turned toward film design as an assistant to an old acquaintance, Ralph Brinton, in 1934. Her career as a designer started with The 5-Pound Man in 1937, when Brinton fell ill and she replaced him as art director. She was later the associate art director to Paul Sheriff on French Without Tears and on The Mikado. On smaller films, she devised the overall look and visual details of those movies, and in the case of larger productions, she decorated the sets devised by the production designer, who was usually either Paul Sheriff or Roger First. Her subsequent movies included Unpublished Story and First of the Few, and The Demi-Paradise before she came to Henry V. Dillon developed an extraordinary reputation in England and around the world in the wake of Henry V. She worked on The Way to the Stars, Olivier's Hamlet, The Rocking Horse Winner, The Importance of Being Earnest, and Olivier's Richard III and The Prince and the Showgirl. She and Roger First won Oscars for their work together on Hamlet. We're in the midst of the courtship scene now, and here I should point out that it wasn't until 1419, almost 4 years after Henry's victory at Agincourt, that peace was achieved with the French on Henry's terms. When he married Catherine, King Charles agreed to recognize Henry as his successor. Olivier has made one cut here, by the way. His wooing of Catherine seems gentle if awkward in the movie. But in the play, Henry describes Catherine as a good soldier breeder, anticipating that she will produce a son that shall fight to Constantinople and take the Turk by the beard. Apart from referring to matters that the film audience wouldn't have fully understood, this line was also a bit coarse and spoke for territorial ambitions on Henry's part that probably would have been closer in spirit to Napoleon or Hitler than would have been appropriate in a morale-boosting World War II film. There's a lot that Shakespeare could take for granted in terms of his audience's knowledge as well as expectations that Olivier absolutely could not, even in England. Shakespeare's history plays cover the most tumultuous period in the history of the English throne. Henry V was one of 10 works built around the crown of England, from King John to Henry VIII. It is the last part of a specific body of 8 works that form a cohesive narrative about the bloody contention for the crown across 2 centuries. The overall chronology, which is delineated in a chart in our supplement on this disc, is often forgotten today, although it would have been common knowledge then. The earliest successions of the English kings after William the Conqueror became king in 1066 were marred by vicious family conflicts. William was killed in a riding accident in 1087 and succeeded by his second oldest son, William Rufus. But William Rufus was killed 13 years later in what may or may not have been a hunting accident, and the throne was then seized by his rebellious younger brother, Henry I. Henry's was a troubled reign in which his chosen successor was drowned and his second marriage was childless. The crown passed laterally to Stephen, the grandson of William the Conqueror. His own son, Eustace, died before succeeding him, and he was succeeded by Henry of Anjou, the son of Henry I's daughter Matilda, in 1154 as Henry II. This is where things get interesting, because Henry II is the founder of the Plantagenet line, which is Henry V's line of succession to the throne. Henry II is most widely remembered today for having instigated the murder of his one-time ally Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in Canterbury Cathedral, immortalized as the subject of the play and the film The Lion in Winter, and also as the father of Richard the Lionhearted and King John. Richard I, or Richard the Lionhearted, was renowned for his military campaigns in the Crusades. He retains a positive image in popular culture today, even in America, mostly because of the virtuous reputation he acquired in the legends surrounding Robin Hood and in Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe. John, who succeeded Richard, has a conversely rotten reputation, mostly thanks to the Robin Hood stories and movies. His reign from 1199 to 1216 was relatively stable, and he was significant as the first English king to be immortalized in one of Shakespeare's plays. If you look at King John, written in the 1590s, a few years before Henry V, you find Shakespeare drawing parallels between John, 400 years removed, and the reign of Elizabeth. It tells the story of a monarch fending off the claims of a sibling rival, the attacks of the Roman Church, and foreign invaders. John was succeeded by his son, Henry III, who was 9 when he became king. As an adult, he was an inept ruler, given to occasional fits of royal pique that left the organized government in shambles. He was constantly at war with his barons and was succeeded even before his death by his son, Edward I, who lived until 1307. His son, Edward II, was deposed and executed in 1327. His son, Edward III, was at first an unwilling successor, but took the throne in 1327 and held it for 50 years, until 1377. It was Edward's claims on the French throne, through his mother Isabella, the daughter of Philip IV of France, that began the 100 Years' War between England and France. Those are Edward III's claims that Henry V is advancing at the opening of the play, and it is Edward III that the French king evokes with such dread in discussing the English threat. Edward III's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, died before he could succeed his father, but he left behind a son, Richard, who ascended the throne as Richard II in 1377. Richard's rule, lasting 22 years, was marred by high taxes, serious struggles with Parliament, and uprisings and rebellion. But Richard's greatest failing as a king was that he didn't leave behind an heir. Without a clear successor, the next 100 years or more of English history were marred by bloody battles for the crown. This is where Shakespeare enters the picture in a big way as a dramatist historian, portraying the strife-ridden reigns of the next 6 kings in a series of 8 history plays. Richard was deposed through an open rebellion led by Henry of Bolingbroke, later Henry IV. Henry was the eldest son of John of Gaunt, Edward the Black Prince's younger brother, and he was Richard II's uncle. That story is told in Richard II, which was written in the mid-1590s. Had his progeny been not quite so ambitious, incidentally, John of Gaunt would be remembered today, if at all, as Geoffrey Chaucer's patron. Henry IV was king for 14 years, from 1399 until 1413, and never had a secure reign. He was beset by open rebellion, especially in Wales and Scotland, and also never overcame the stain of regicide for Richard II's having died in his captivity. He had a son, also Henry, who was a notorious rake and playboy in his early adult life. And those two threads, the rebellion against his rule and the struggle to find worthiness in young Henry, provided the focus for Shakespeare's Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, written in the late 1590s. The charges of Henry IV's regicide continued to haunt Henry V after he took the throne in 1413. But he found legitimacy to his rule in the claim to the French throne, which he genuinely believed that he was entitled to by way of his descent from Edward III. Among the men who served in Henry's army in France was one Owen Tudor, a Welshman who performed with great bravery at Agincourt. He was made personal squire to the king. Henry and Catherine married in 1419, and Henry was named as heir to the throne of France. And 3 years later they had a son, also named Henry. But that same year, 1422, Henry V died. Catherine later married Owen Tudor, and their eldest child was Edmund, the Earl of Richmond, who married Margaret Beaufort, a direct descendant of Edward III and John of Gaunt. That marriage became very important to Shakespeare and everyone else of his generation in the year 1457, when Edmund and Margaret had a son also named Henry. Meanwhile, the crown of England lay in the hands of the young successor and a series of appointed regents ruling in his name. It was during this period that the English defeated Joan of Arc in their continuing wars in France. The rule of Henry VI began the Wars of the Roses between the House of York, led by Richard, the Duke of York, and the House of Lancaster, of which Henry was head. Henry VI, his rule dramatized in the 3 Shakespeare plays of that name, was deposed by Edward IV in 1461. Edward was succeeded briefly by his 13-year-old son, Edward, and then by his brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, who became king as Richard III. But Richard was unable to hold power, and 2 years later was deposed by Henry, the Earl of Richmond, the grandson of Owen Tudor and Catherine, and a descendant of Edward III through his mother, Margaret. Henry VII, who was king from 1485 to 1509, established the Tudor line. His son was, of course, Henry VIII, and his granddaughter was Elizabeth I, and that brings us to Shakespeare's time. And so does the film at this point, back to the Globe Playhouse. Henry V, written in the final flourish of Elizabeth's reign, represents an account of what could be considered the nexus of their claim to the throne. It not only recounts what, from an English point of view, was the lingering boldness and grandeur of Edward III's lineage, to which the Tudors traced their ancestry, but the battle and the high point in the life of the king under whom the founder of their royal house, Owen Tudor, earned his place of honor. And it introduces Catherine, great-great-grandmother of Elizabeth, and co-founder of the Tudor line, and depicts her as a woman with the good sense to fall in love with an English king. If this finale seems like a royal pageant, it really was, celebrating the run-up in history, if you will, to the founding of Elizabeth's line, with lots of very serious ideas and complexities delineated in getting there. In essence, Shakespeare did, in his time, what Olivier later repeated on another level with his film of Henry V. Breathed life into statues, legends, icons out of history, and made audiences removed from them by hundreds of years care about their stories. And isn't what is done here with the boys' choir just delightful? They were seen in this overhead position in the last French court scene as elements of the stage production intrude into that section of the picture, and here they are, led by Robert Helpmann as the actor playing the Bishop of Ely. The melody that they're singing, by the way, was derived from a contemporary source, a movement out of the Fitzwilliam Book of the Virginal, to be played on keyboard. Walton adapted it for chorus here. Henry V heralded the opening of a golden age in the filming of Shakespeare. Just 2 years after its release in England, Republic Pictures, no less, financed Orson Welles' Macbeth, which, in turn, led the same filmmaker to begin work on his legendary Othello. Olivier filmed Hamlet in 1948 and achieved tremendous success, using a far different approach to adapting Shakespeare. This model again comes up. The opening and closing sequences were the last visual shot for the film in the spring of 1944. Constructing that model took 4 months. Olivier's later Shakespeare films would impress audiences on other levels. Richard III, in particular, is a more complex character study of an English king. And the later films were, in the minds of many scholars, truer to their sources. None of the others was done in the middle of a war, of course. Just to show you how Olivier worked on Henry V, it ran over its initial budget, and the Rank Organization rescued the movie. But Olivier ultimately used more than 3/4 of the film that he shot. That's an astonishing figure when you consider that typically a director will use only 1/3 or 1/4 of the film that is exposed, the rest going to retakes and abandoned sequences. But this was a necessity in an era in which the production of Technicolor film, and even Technicolor cameras, had to remain a very low priority. What you see on the screen is virtually everything that was shot. There were variant cuts of Henry V at first. Early release prints ran anywhere up to 159 minutes, but what Olivier found worked best was the edition that we see here at 139. Even today, it dazzles the viewer with its convergences of styles and influences, all drawn together in a coherent, graceful manner. Its influence extends to Brannach's Henry V, and also even into movies such as Bergman's Magic Flute, which used the very same opera within a film approach. There's even room for a little in-joke that you may notice within those credits, Ernest Thesiger as the French ambassador, the Duke of Berry. That was not a role in the play, it was added. But it was the Duke of Berry's Book of Hours that provided the visual guide for large sections of Henry V, and why not represent the man? You could spend months finding little details like that. This is a movie that continues to yield surprises, some of which, along with a sense of the work and thought that went into it, I hope I've provided in this little talk. This is Bruce Eder, thanking you for joining me for this presentation of Henry V.